Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Banks, titled Goddess. So over a month ago, when I reviewed the debut album from UK girl group Neon Jungle, the album titled Welcome to the Jungle, there was one song that really stood out in terms of its production and placement on the album. An eerie, reverb-punctuated song called The Waiting Game, which had well-framed lyrics and context that could really back up the heady drama of the song. I really liked it, one of the highlights of the album. It was an interesting shift for Neon Jungle, and I liked the song's inclusion, but it wasn't long before everybody in the comments informed me that I couldn't really give full credit to the girl group for Waiting Game. No. More credit belonged to Jillian Banks, often going by her surname as her stage name, and who was the American R&B singer-songwriter who originally wrote and performed that song. So I decided to go check out her version of it, and honestly, it's probably even better, concentrating the emotion on one performer and heightening that sense of real intimacy and fragility across the entire song. So yeah, you can bet that I was curious to check out that debut album when it finally came to drop this year. A composite record composed of material from her first two EPs and new material. So, okay, not exactly a good side when it comes to album cohesion, but you know what? Surely it would manage to come together somewhat, right? It's all got a similar sound, right? Honestly, not as well as I was hoping for, because Goddess by Banks, while no means being bad, isn't exactly gripping, or at least not as gripping as I was hoping for. It's a bit of a shame, too, because given that some of the hype behind Banks is a potential American counterpart to FKA Twigs and her incredibly solid LP1. But the more I listen through Goddess, the more I realize that there really isn't a lot here to sustain a record that comes across as too underwritten for its length and too overproduced to really flatter its singer. And when you realize that most of this album falls into very conventional indie R&B territory for subject matter and its sound, you get an album that's unfortunately a lot less interesting than it's initially expected. So, okay, you know what? Let's start with Banks herself. And honestly, I'm a little conflicted about her. She's not exactly the most breathtaking R&B singer to step up to the microphone in terms of range or vocal ability, but I can't deny that there are plenty of points on this album where she does nail the quieter, more vulnerable, emotional beats pretty damn effectively. Her voice comes across as less directly soulful and more along the lines of the huskier delivery of a singer-songwriter that might come from the indie folk scene, which means that Banks tends to stay a lot more in her mid-range as a vocalist. Now this is both good and bad. Good because she never sounds uncomfortable singing in this record, but that also means she never creates any dramatic crescendos through her voice either to really enhance the drama. She doesn't really tend to skirt much outside of this range. And this is a real peculiarity about Banks' delivery. Considering the dramatic situations that she often chooses to sing about, her delivery doesn't exactly show a lot of dramatic investment because she can sound so detached or separate from the situation. It doesn't help matters that she can occasionally drop in towards baby-voiced cooing or just having her words mushed together in the verses, which honestly is not flattering, and she's probably one of the factors to why this album is just not working for me as much. Now granted, the production doesn't exactly help her here. Banks brought together a selection of up-and-coming indie R&B producers to really help with this record, but its compilation nature from the EPs do render it a bit of a hodgepodge instrumentally, lacking a fair bit of cohesion. And this inconsistency leads to an album with some really stark hits and some really stark misses. The gospel-inspired, pseudo-gothic, and gorgeous swell of Waiting Game balanced against the inert, flat synth backdrop of Alibi. You might have your interweaving keyboard melodies and distant echoing drums of Brains against the messy mix of Fuck 'Em Only We Know, which reminds me a lot more than it really should of that gutless Keen song from 2009 that was trying to be the Goo Goo Dolls and failing. And like most indie R&B, it relies way too much on percussion and hazy ambient mood over any sort of proper melody. A real problem that Banks doesn't show as much investment as she should, and the mix frequently feels overstuffed with synth effects, pitch shifting, and electronic pieces that only seem to distract from the album's overall atmosphere. It's very telling that when Banks steps towards a more stripped back presentation, like on the piano ballad, You Should Know Where I'm Coming From, or the lonely acoustic love song Someone New, they feel a little bit more authentic to me. Although part of this issue might be the tempo of this album. It's already almost an hour long at 14 tracks, but the glacial pace of some of these songs make make them feel even longer, especially when they can't back up the pace, and it makes tracks with more of a definitive energy like Begging for Thread or Brain stand out all the more in a good way. But of course, we need to start talking about the lyrics. And look, it's an R&B album. I've come to not to expect a lot here lyrically, and unsurprisingly, I didn't get much here lyrically in terms of wordplay or content. On a technical basis, Banks' form of songwriting is somewhat unique, comprised of sentences that run together, ignoring most rhyming meter entirely, but there are points when that sort of songwriting can work. But the larger issue is that her poetry, it's nothing all that special in terms of setting her scenes, especially on her ballads, where she can step towards some really maudlin high school territory, especially on You Should Know Where I'm Coming From. Oh, song warning guys away from her because she's just so damaged. Emo much? And from there, most of her songs fall into your archetypal R&B relationship songs. The hookup and love tracks on Stick, Fuck 'Em Only We Know, Warm Water, and Under the Table, and the very troubled relationship tracks of Alibi, Waiting Game, This Is What It Feels Like, Drowning, Begging for Thread, and Change. Now, to be fair, where Banks' songwriting tends to work is in some of the framing. On Change and Drowning, for instance, she creates very stark, very detailed pictures of the douchebags on these relationships and how they treat her, and the righteous smackdowns that they so justly deserve, while both Waiting Game and Begging for Thread, they frame the vulnerability and flaws really quite well. And the songs not tied to relationships can be just as good. Brain is a challenge for the guy to stop overthinking his actions and yet not be afraid to come across as more intelligent, which is really more of a strength than he might realize. I like that theme, that's well executed. And then there's Someone New, a slower love song to a man she had to leave behind when she went on tour, and assurances that she really is coming back to him. That's something special, I like that sort of song. But on the reverse of those songs, however, is Alibi, the opening song and by far the worst track on this album, because it tries to go for an apology for her boyfriend and convince her that she's not a monster, and then it includes this line, "You turned me into this." Bit of a mixed message there, and it really looks like Bank is trying to deflect for no good reason. But you know what, that's a pretty minor gripe, because really the lyrics aren't so much bad as they can just feel interchangeable at some points, lacking real lyrical highlights and wordplay that really sticks with me, even though there is some of the variety in some of the situations and the framing that's put together here. And honestly, that's pretty much where I fall on Goddess. It's not so much a bad album, but just one overloaded with unnecessary elements that aren't needed and detract from the overall appearance and overall feel of this album. And while I'm definitely not sold on Banks as the frontwoman, I think it could have helped a little bit more if the production had a little bit more energy and melody, or the lyrics could add a little bit more creativity, or the album at least tried to stand out a little bit more from the crowd, be a little bit more unique here. Even though it is playing for a more radio-friendly template, and I get it's playing for that template, it pales in comparison to LP1 from FKA Twigs, a glitchier, tighter record with a lot more potent singer whose humanity was underscored with every single bit of texture. Whereas Goddess, it's very much like its titular figure, pretty, untouchable, ethereal, and yet much more difficult to connect with on any level, at least for me. For me, I'm giving it a very light 6 out of 10, and a very cautious recommendation seems fair. And if you're into this brand of R&B, give it a listen. Otherwise, there's no shortage of other stuff in this genre, and Banks' material, unfortunately, does not stand out all that much. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If you can't tell, my throat is a little bit raspy. That's because I'm coming off of a pretty violent episode of being sick for the past week. That's probably the reason why I haven't uploaded any reviews. Yes, there was albums that came out in the previous week that I'm going to be handling. Don't worry, I'm getting to it. I've got a schedule all figured out. But if there's anything else coming out that you want me to take a look at going forward, or if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'd be more than happy to give it a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.